Welcome back to DC Decoded, where we break down what happens when artificial intelligence meets the nation's capital. I'm your host, Sam Lee. Today, we're doing something special. Our first proper Substack live episode. No more recaps with Jabari and Catherine, though I'm sure we'll do one at some point. But this is real stuff this time, guys. And joining us is our trusty guest, John Hopkins Gillespie, Director of Policy and Product Counsel at Trustable. John is a familiar voice to DC Decoded listeners. He's appeared on two previous episodes where he has shared his insights on responsible AI, both by himself and with a trustable colleague. Tonight, we're going to dive deep into the White House's AI action plan and what that means for companies. John, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Sam. And I am very excited to be part of the first Substack Live that you're doing. So this is very exciting.
Yes, it's less work for me. That's what it translates to. So that's why we're
Oh,
doing
perfect.
it.
We love that. Work smarter, not harder, right?
Yeah, I'm tired, guys. Let's dive deeper into the action plan. So, according to this document, which I have here,
Oh,
it's
wow.
a big bold text: "Winning the race." This action plan was released last month by the White House, and it centers around three pillars. The first pillar is accelerating AI innovation. The second is building American AI infrastructure. And the third is leading in international AI diplomacy and security. So, John, before we get into the blog you wrote breaking down this action plan very thoroughly, can you first explain a bit how did we get here? Why is the White House releasing this plan in July of 2025? What's the significance of this plan?
Yeah. So this really started after President Trump took office in January, where he issued an executive order that essentially said that the U.S. was going to dominate AI innovation, and those are his words, not my words, from the executive order. And as part of that executive order, there was a call to OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, to solicit comments from the community, from industry, from academia to create an AI action plan. And so that executive order, I believe, issued on January 23rd. And then in February, the actual request for information, the RFI, came out. It's very unique. And for those folks who are familiar with like what typically RFIs or requests for comments look like, they're usually fairly detailed and they ask for specific points of interest. They're looking to kind of point commenters towards, some kind of end goal. And this was very unique in that it was about a paragraph and it was basically give us your ideas and tell us what you think, which can be a double-edged sword. On one hand, when you kind of open that up, you can get a lot of interesting insights, right? Instead of narrowing the scope of the inquiry, you can get a lot of different perspectives, a lot of voices from industry, from small business. On the other hand, if you're not scoping the inquiry properly, it can be difficult to kind of develop, the kind of targeted recommendations that you're looking for in these kinds of requests for comments or requests for information. So it's again, very unique in that regard. Um, the comment period closed in March. I believe it was March 15th. They received over 10,000 comments, which
Oh,
was insane.
yeah.
Of course, all of the big players submitted comments: OpenAI, Anthropic, Google. Um, Trustable also submitted comments. Shameless plug. Um, and I have a sneaking suspicion, just given the administration's proclivity for wanting to use AI across the federal government, they may have used AI to analyze those comments. Because 10,000 comments, depending on the length and the type and the font, can be really hard to us to get through. Um, and then they took all of those comments, they developed the record, and then we get to July and we release the action plan. And so OSTP had, I believe, 180 days or 120 days to develop this action plan. And so they went through the proper process, you know, solicit input from the community, and then develop an action plan. And so we arrived to the end of July when the administration released it. They released it with three companion executive orders, which of course we can talk about as well. But the crux of the action plan was, as you said, structured around three pillars with roughly 90 recommendations, and then three of these companion executive orders to operationalize some of those recommendations.
Right. And you wrote a blog on Trustable breaking down the action plan. The actual title is what the Trump administration's AI action plan means for enterprises. And that's live on Trustable's blog. And also, we reposted it on our Substack. I actually want to start at the conclusion and ask
Yeah.
you when you wrote, the AI action plan is the most comprehensive vision for AI policy released in the second Trump administration. It also articulates a strong break from previous AI policy initiatives under Biden and the first Trump administration that emphasized AI safety and risk management. So, what does that shift signal to the industry? What should they be on guard for now?
Yeah, so truthfully, the action plan is kind of the culmination of a very thought through narrative from the beginning of the second Trump administration, which has been we're leaning into AI innovation. And so, I said that because I was tracking developments under Trump 1 in terms of, what the administration was looking at when it came to AI policy. And there was actually, interestingly enough, a priority on AI safety, responsible AI adoption. Some themes that carry through into the Biden administration that maybe the Biden administration fleshed out a little more, or drilled into when it came out with the AI Bill of Rights and the executive order, and the NIST AI risk management framework, which actually the development of which started under the first Trump administration. And this action plan really signals a break in that conversation about responsible AI adoption and AI safety. And so, some of the themes that we see in this action plan are centered around innovation, the idea that we do not want to shackle companies who are trying to innovate. We want the best products, best services, best ideas in the marketplace when it comes to AI. And so the concept around, deregulation, cutting red tape, making sure that companies have the energy sources that they need, and, again, or, getting rid of some of these more onerous regulations. That's really the theme that we're seeing here. And so there's not a lot of talk about responsible AI adoption in the plan. There is talk about security. We can certainly dive into that a little bit more. And there is some talk about standards, but it really is about accelerating AI adoption, and coming up with, AI literacy programs, upskilling, developing a workforce that's ready for AI, and then international standard setting. Those are kind of the big takeaway themes when we're thinking about like how that breaks away from, Trump's one and the Biden administration.
Right. And one thing I noticed reading through the document is it listed all the things you noted both now and in the article, but it's definitely part of the larger strategy initiatives we've seen from the Trump administration 2.0. For example, in the first pillar about accelerating AI innovation, you also note that one of the policy recommendations the plan suggests is that NIST revise or revisit its AI risk management framework, or AI RMF, to remove references to diversity, equity, and inclusion and climate change. So they're kind of just putting those things together. And if anybody's been following the Trump administration, those two initiatives of repealing DEI and climate change just kind of across the board in American society have been key points in the administration. So for AI companies, though, are there big practical implications for that? Like, were AI companies or companies who use AI like at the forefront of DI and climate change initiatives, or is it just more consistent rhetoric for the administration?
Yeah, no, so this does actually have organizational impacts. And so, we hear things like removing DEI and climate change from these, previously established standards. And, I kind of talk about this in the blog, but, one of the big takeaways is this upends regulatory certainty. And if there's one thing that companies, appreciate and want, it is regulatory certainty. They want to know what are the rules of the road. They want to know what the guardrails are going to be. so they can talk to their legal teams, their compliance teams, their engineering teams, and they understand when they're producing products, when they're developing these products, what are the rules and standards that are going to govern these products? Um, the NIST AI risk management frameworks is, it does have criticism. It's certainly not criticism around substantive content in terms of DEI and climate change. It has criticisms more around whether or not it's easily operational or if it's clear enough to help practically guide companies on responsible AI adoption. But that's a different conversation. What we're talking about here is, upending a standard based on a couple of frankly buzzword phrases like DEI and climate change. And when we're thinking about AI talent pipelines, for example, right? That's something that may have a DEI implication because you're thinking about how do we have diverse stakeholders at the table who develop systems, not because, we're looking at this for DEI's sake. We're looking at it from when you're developing these systems pre-deployment, you need to think about what voices are in the room to make sure that as the systems are being deployed, they're accounting for these differences, right? Like they're accounting for the audiences that are going to use them. And so if you're cutting voices out of those conversations, it becomes really hard to develop systems that are actually reflective of the users that are going to be interacting with them. I
Right.
also know in the blog that DEI explicitly is only mentioned twice. It's actually not difficult to do like a control find to see how many times DEI is explicitly referenced. And so then it really raises questions. Well, okay, if we're talking about two explicit instances, what could the auxiliary DEI topics be that may get removed that again could lead to some of this uncertainty when it comes to the standard? And very briefly on the climate change point, you know, eh, we don't have to get into a discussion about, what's happening with climate change policy. I think the real thing is companies are very cognizant about the energy and resource consumptions of data centers and AI, compute. And so they may have, environmental policies and frameworks in place that take these things into account. And so to say that we need to remove these concepts from a standard is not really, it's not promoting this idea of, environmentalism. It's more about do we have the resources to actually support the compute power? And we've seen some of these issues pop up when it comes to energy consumption, when it comes to water consumption. If we look at places like Texas and Arizona, we see that water is an issue when it comes to these data centers. And so, when we're thinking about climate and we're thinking about the environment, we're thinking about, okay, do we have the resources to actually support demand for these systems? And so, again, this really all funnels back to we have a standard that's established. Companies are free to interpret what that standard means on their own volition. Do we really need to upset what has already been established in the sake of potentially furthering a narrative?
Right. And you point out this contradiction when discussing the second pillar about actually building the American AI infrastructure. You mentioned how the underlying point of a lot of the recommendations is inherently contradictory because, on one hand, it is calling for the rapid expansion of energy sources because, of course, as AI continues to develop, the energy to support that is only going to grow exponentially. But that comes almost into direct conflict with the administration's stated views on climate change, which include, of course, like sustainability efforts
Mhm.
for improving energy efficiency. So, what do companies do as they continue to develop? Of course, like this is not a mandate, and you make that clear as well. But how do you reconcile that contradiction if you're just a company that wants to develop AI products or AI services?
Yeah, I mean, I think this really comes back to, we have standards in place, and it makes it very difficult for companies to make decisions when they're not sure what the guardrails or the rules of the road are. And I do think it is an interesting kind of juxtaposition where we're talking about, and this is actually what one of the companion executive orders talks about, is helping to unleash some of this regulatory burden when it comes to energy. But when we're talking about energy for data centers, right, we really want to think about it from an all of the above approach. And really, we're looking at it, based off of this action plan as an all of the above with a caveat, which is
Right.
we want energy sources, but we don't want renewable energy sources. And,
Right.
you know, you don't have to be a fan of solar, wind, or any other renewables, but it is helpful in the conversation when we're thinking about how can we help keep up with the demand? Can we help modernize the grid? Like these are things that can help us get to a place where we can meet the demands of the AI compute power. So it is very interesting to see kind of us cutting ourselves off at our knees again, potentially to further a political narrative. Like we don't have to get into that, but again, when we're thinking about how can we support the infrastructure, um, we're not helping ourselves when we're kind of cutting off sources that can help us keep up with that demand.
One of the most multi-pronged sections I found in the plan was under Pillar 1, when the plan goes into how to empower American workers in the age of AI. And I think it's a section that a lot of people employed right now would find worthwhile to read. But these policy actions don't just span one agency or one department. It kind of runs the gauntlet. You have the more generic lines, such as led by the Department of Labor, Department of Education, prioritize AI skill development as a core objective. That can mean a lot of things. But then you have things like led by the Department of Treasury, issue guidance clarifying that AI literacy and AI skill development programs may qualify as eligible educational assistance under Section 132 of the Internal Revenue Code. So basically giving like tax
Mhm.
incentives as well to create or further AI skill development programs. I was curious, when you were looking through this section, or just generally how the plan's talking about empowering American workers with AI skills, what seemed like the most promising to you?
Yeah, so I'll make a point here to say that it's really interesting. There's only one of the subsections in Pillar One that talks about the American workforce, and it talks about reskilling and figuring out how to provide Americans with skill sets. The rest of the literacy education focused provisions actually sit under Pillar Two, which is
Yeah.
infrastructure. And it's maybe an interesting thought exercise as to, why are we thinking about, educational literacy issues as infrastructure versus adoption? Because I do think
Mm,
that accelerating AI adoption starts with understanding the technology and understanding how to use it, how to interact with it, how to prompt correctly. Like, I think there's a whole host of components that sit under that educational piece that help accelerate adoption. And yes, there's like a good argument for why it could sit under infrastructure, but I think it's an interesting point to make that this is not actually sit under the adoption part of the plan. It sits under infrastructure. That being said, I do actually agree with the administration's focus on, reskilling, upskilling, focusing on, funding programs that help transition workers from kind of this, you know, interesting turn of the century economy to the more technologically focused economy. Also, I'm really sorry that it's gotten dark. I made the mistake of wanting to enjoy a nice DC evening, and I've noticed that my screen has gotten progressively darker than your screen. So I am so sorry that I'm getting darker and darker as the conversation goes on.
that's
Um,
okay. For anybody just listening in, John was just doing a bit, so no need to be concerned. But yeah,
Yeah,
continue.
no,
It's okay.
I'm doing fine. It is a really nice evening out though. But I do appreciate that there is a focus from the administration on figuring out how to transition workers from, again, this kind of turn of the century internet economy to a more technologically advanced economy, and how we think about incentivizing companies to do this. How do we incentivize companies to reskill? How do we incentivize them to train them? And so I think offering tax incentives and thinking about how we can leverage the existing tax code and potentially reforming the tax code to offer incentives for these kinds of programs, I think is actually a really smart idea. I think it will prompt companies to think about what they can be doing to reap some of these benefits, from the tax code, while also doing the right thing when it comes to reskilling and retraining their workforces, are also helping their workforce understand that these tools, are not bad, right? Like they can actually help improve efficiency. They can kind of take some of the more burdensome tasks off of their workforce and help them focus on other things. So I do think that there's probably it's a well thought out set of recommendations when it comes to the literacy pieces and the education pieces when it comes to AI.
Let's shift to pillar three, leading in international AI diplomacy and security. I want to start with something you had noted that is more critical of the plan, where you say that it's notable that out of the 23 pages, there's only three dedicated
Yes.
to international engagement on AI related issues. And I think what was especially relevant is you bring in our biggest geopolitical rival, China, to compare with their recently released action plan on AI as well that leans much more heavily into international engagement. So, what are the implications of that? Let's start there. Like, why does it matter that there's only three out of 23 with the actual world considered in this?
Yeah, no, so I point that out really, I mean, less as a criticism and more as a red flag in the sense that, the administration talks a lot about the competition with China. And it's not an ill-founded concern, right? Like we are in a geopolitical rivalry with China when it comes to a host of issues, and technology and AI is one of them. And we see that when it comes to manufacturing AI chips, right? And there's concerns about, exporting chips from NVIDIA and AMD to China. And so I did find it interesting that there's only 3 pages when we're thinking about, well, AI, crosses borders, it, crosses continents, um, it has geopolitical implications, and the US should be the leader when it comes to these issues. And so there is a recommendation about the US being involved in standard setting bodies, which is great. I noted as you said, 3 days after our action plan came out, China released their AI action plan, and one of the things that they doubled down on was, using the UN and leveraging the UN as an international forum for setting AI standards. And the UN is interested in establishing a global standard body that sits within it, to help develop these things. And if the US is not a strong voice at the table, if we're not participating in the way that we need to, we will not be represented. Our interests will not be represented. China will be able to build a coalition that can effectively undermine some of the values and ideas that we would want to promote in these forums. And so, for the US, it really is about not just participating and helping set standards. It really is about being a strong voice, like being the superpower voice in the room on these issues. Because if we are not, someone else will be, and in this case, it will be China.
I've got a couple more questions for you. I want to start with how you mentioned that AI crosses borders, and that makes me think of technology more broadly and companies that don't just operate in one jurisdiction, whether that's multinational companies or companies that operate in many states. I think something that was really popular or just talked about earlier in the summer was a potential ban on AI regulation at the state and local level for
Mhm.
10 years. And that was part of a whole bigger bill, but that sparked a lot of controversy. I think one thing that this action plan talks about is potentially targeting states that aren't basically promoting AI in their own states by having just a patchwork compliance that companies have to deal with. Like what goes in Colorado might be different than what goes in Texas to what goes in California. But because AI does, of course, like it's not like you stop at the border and the AI just recognizes that it's somewhere different. Like how effective are state regulations when it's dealing with something that's like inherently stateless and doesn't really like respect those borders or is not that affected, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think, look, it's a fair criticism to say that as, states are getting in the game and they're having different rules of the road, it does make it hard to comply. And, we've seen this start to play out quite a bit when it comes to data privacy, and we've seen it play out with cybersecurity rules. And what qualifies as PII and sensitive PII and what notification obligations, different states have when it comes to, data breaches and data incidences. Um, but I will say the moratorium conversation was unhelpful in the sense that it was banning states or prohibiting states from acting without an alternative from the federal government. And, and again, in furthering a narrative about, AI innovation and the kind of unshackling these companies, when truthfully, again, and this goes back to the point I kind of made at the time, is that having guardrails and rules of the road when they're common sense, it's not a bad thing. And most companies would say, as long as it's not overly burdensome, and it's not overly prescriptive, and there's latitude and there's safe harbors, and there's appropriate mechanisms to have conversations with regulators. um, they like these rules. They're fine with these rules. They just don't want regimes that are adding complexity for complexity's sake, right? If there is, a common sense way to disclose to consumers that they're interacting with an AI system, or there's a common sense way to make sure that transparency is happening along the AI value chain, that's fine. It's when you get into the minutia, and this is the criticism, quite frankly, with not my criticism, but criticism generally speaking with the EU AI Act about, some of the minutia of what needs to and doesn't need to be disclosed to third parties and those in the value chain. And so, if it's common sense, if it's light touch, we've seen some states experiment with these kinds of rules. Utah has rules on the book about disclosures when it comes to high risk systems and in certain circumstances. Texas has rules on the book. Florida is looking to explore some safety related rules. Clearly it's not bad. It crosses party lines when we're thinking about what is common sense and what can make sense when it comes to, interactions from the public and what makes sense from supply chain issues. But, to impose a moratorium at the federal level with no alternative regime in place that gives any kind of assurances, that really hinders adoption, quite honestly, because the public is having some trust issues with AI, quite frankly. Like they're not seeing they're seeing the benefits, but they're not believing that AI is acting in their best interest. And so we're only seeing trust levels in the 40s when it comes to surveys that are out there. So when you have, rules of the road that increase transparency, that demonstrate that there's, responsible practices up and down the supply chain, that helps assure the public that things going on behind the scenes are actually operating in their best interest and not necessarily something to be thought of when it comes to like a check the box exercise, right? Like this is actually demonstrating to people who are using these systems they're safe, they're reliable, they're tested. If things go wrong, we understand that those things happen and we have a process in place to fix them. Like rules are not bad. Prescriptive rules can be bad.
Right. Right. After analyzing this plan, what do you think's missing from it? Like, what do you wish was in it that isn't?
So there's a couple things. The one big thing, and I think this has actually gotten a lot of play in the week since the plan has been out, is the fact that it does not address IP issues. It doesn't address copyright issues, and that's a big issue. And we're seeing this being litigated in courts across the country. And it will impact people's livelihoods. This is, not an insignificant issue when it comes to, marketing concerns, when it comes to actors, when it comes to, voice actors, when it comes to musicians, content creators, like this is a big issue. And so the fact that the plan didn't really have any discussion, I mean, it had no discussion about IP or copyright issues. And that is something that I think maybe folks were hoping to see here and that didn't happen. I think the other big point that is missing here is, agentic AI.
Mm,
The conversation has started shifting around what agentic AI looks like. I'm working myself on kind of ideating on, what we should be thinking about as we emerge into a more agentic AI era. But it really didn't talk about agentic AI,
yeah,
and what we should be thinking about. And, not to say that anybody has the silver bullet answer at the moment, um, but just a nod in that direction, I think, would kind of show the forward thought on the issue, and that just it wasn't there. Um, and yes, the issue's new, but it's not that new that it couldn't have made it into the plan. So I find both of those issues very interesting that they're absent. And actually, I'm sorry, I'll
you're
say
good.
one more thing. I promise, and then I'm done. Um, we don't see any discussion about safety. We see
Mm,
a lot of discussion around security and the robustness of the systems when it comes to cybersecurity issues. We don't see a lot of talk about risks from the system and mitigations for those risks. And I think partially, a lot of the common risks that we think about are bias and discrimination. And maybe that is why we decided to move away from safety aspects. I'm not 100% certain, but there are other risks to be thinking about, when it comes to like hallucination and performance drift, over
yeah.
reliance on these systems, right? Like there are other risks that would kind of fall outside of, what some could classify as woke that should be considered. And that conversation wasn't in this plan at all either.
We're going to wrap there. We could probably talk all day long about AI innovation and regulation, but progress around AI is not going to stop. So we will leave that for future episodes. If you enjoy this conversation, make sure to subscribe to DC Decoded on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube, because people apparently watch podcasts on YouTube now. And if you found this discussion valuable, we'd love it if you left a rating or review. If you're watching or listening on Substack, consider recommending us. Trustable as well has a great Substack. There'll be a co-author on this post. And for more on the DC chapter of the AI Collective, upcoming events, and ways to get involved via collaborations, check out the links in the show description. John, thank you as always for coming on to DC Decoded. I'm sure we will have more conversations, but thank you again for your third time. You're a friend of the show now. Three times, and
I,
I guess I've just designated you as our first friend of the show.
I am always honored, Sam. So I appreciate you giving airtime 3 times to me.
All right. Take care, everyone. See you next time.